The flashing red and blue lights painted the night as Officer Greg Mitchell pulled over a sleek black SUV. Another routine stop, another face he expected to intimidate. But as he approached the driver's side, something felt off. The man inside wasn't panicked. He wasn't fumbling for excuses. Instead, he stared Greg down with an unsettling calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, voice steady, authoritative. Greg hesitated. Something about him seemed familiar. But before he could place it, the man reached into his glove compartment, pulled out an ID, and handed it over. Greg's stomach dropped. Captain Darnell Briggs, Police Department. A black police captain. The very kind of man Greg had spent his career profiling. His throat went dry. What happens when a racist cop pulls over the one man who holds the power to destroy his career? What will Captain Briggs do with this moment of reckoning? And most importantly, when the truth comes out, who will be on trial? Watch the whole story to uncover the shocking twist that changes everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Officer Greg Lawson tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he patrolled the quiet streets of Ridgewood. The small town didn't see much action, but Greg had his way of keeping things in order. He didn't need a reason to stop specific drivers. He just trusted his instincts. And tonight, his instincts locked onto a sleek black SUV cruising through the intersection. He didn't care that the vehicle wasn't speeding, or that it had correctly stopped at the red light. What mattered was the driver, a black man. Greg smirked and flicked on his sirens. The SUV pulled over immediately, rolling to a smooth stop. Greg adjusted his belt, making sure his hand rested near his holster. As he exited the patrol car, his mind raced through the usual routine. The driver may have had outstanding warrants. Perhaps he was some thug in a stolen car. But he didn't know what he never could have expected, that he had just pulled over his worst nightmare. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged black man with a commanding presence. His face was calm, but his piercing eyes locked onto Greg with an unsettling intensity. "License and registration," Greg barked, standing tall. He wanted to establish dominance right away. The man inside the car didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his glove compartment in a smooth, practiced motion and retrieved his documents. He handed them over without a word. Greg snatched them and skimmed over the name. Captain Daniel Briggs. His heart skipped a beat. Captain? Greg's pulse quickened as his eyes drifted to the department logo on the ID. His blood ran cold. Daniel Briggs wasn't just any driver. He was a high-ranking police captain. Greg's superior. For the first time in his career, Greg felt trapped. The realization clawed at his chest. He had pulled over a man with the power to dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. A lump formed in his throat, but he kept a straight face. He couldn't back down now. He had a decision to make. Would he let his arrogance push him forward, or would he admit his mistake before it was too late? But before he could decide, Captain Briggs spoke, and his following words would turn Greg's world upside down. Greg Lawson's grip on the documents tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reread the name. Captain Daniel Briggs. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to maintain his usual intimidating stance. But Captain Briggs wasn't intimidated, not one bit. He sat still in the driver's seat, eyes calm but sharp, as if dissecting Greg's every move. The weight of his authority filled the air, pressing down on Greg like an invisible force. Then, Briggs finally spoke. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, firm, yet controlled, carrying the kind of authority that sent shivers down the spines of rookies in the academy. Greg's mouth felt dry. He could feel the sweat forming on the back of his neck. He had spent years stopping drivers like this, throwing his weight around, making them squirm. But now the roles had reversed. Greg cleared his throat and forced himself to sound confident. "You were, driving suspiciously." Briggs raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his face. "Suspiciously?" Greg hesitated. "Yeah. You hesitated at the stop sign." Silence. A tense, suffocating silence. Then, a low chuckle escaped from Briggs. It wasn't the laugh of someone who found something funny. It was the laugh of someone who saw straight through a lie. "Let me get this straight," Briggs said, shifting slightly in his seat. "You pulled me over for following traffic laws?" Greg felt his face grow hot. His mind scrambled for an escape. Briggs leaned forward just enough to make Greg uncomfortable. "Tell me, Officer Lawson," he said, his voice calm and unwavering, "would you have pulled this car over if the driver looked like you?" Greg's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched near his belt. A spark of anger flickered in his gut. Anger at himself for making this mistake, and anger at Briggs for putting him in this position. "I don't see color," Greg snapped. "I do my job." Briggs exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Right." He took his license and registration back from Greg's frozen hands, his movements slow, deliberate. Then he did something Greg wasn't expecting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. Not just any badge, a captain's badge. The golden shield glowed under the streetlights, a stark reminder of the authority Greg had unknowingly tried to challenge. Greg felt his stomach drop. Briggs studied him for a moment before tucking the badge away. Then, with unnerving calmness, he spoke. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words, Officer Lawson, because this traffic stop, it's over, but what happens next depends entirely on you." Greg's breath hitched. His entire career now hung in the balance. He could feel it the moment everything shifted, and he had no idea how this was going to end. Greg Lawson's mind raced. His career, his reputation, everything was on the line. He had pulled over a black police captain under pretenses, and now that same man was staring him down with an authority Greg could no longer deny. For years, Greg had gotten away with stops like these, thinly veiled excuses, bogus infractions, a flex of power over people he assumed had none. But this time he had unknowingly crossed the wrong man. The street was eerily quiet, the night air thick with tension. Greg's fingers twitched near his belt as his instincts screamed at him to regain control of the situation. "I was just doing my job," Greg muttered, his voice losing its usual edge. Briggs tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Your job?" he repeated. "Tell me, Officer Lawson, what exactly is your job?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "To serve and protect." Briggs let out a slow breath. "And yet, here we are." The words stung. Greg had nothing to say. Briggs continued, his voice unwavering. "Do you even realize what you were about to do? If I had been any other black man, you would have had me out of this car by now, hands on the hood, searching for something that was never there." Greg's face twitched. "That's not true." Briggs's gaze sharpened. "Isn't it?" A lump formed in Greg's throat. He had spent his whole career convincing himself he wasn't like the cops who made the headlines, the ones caught on camera and whose names became synonymous with injustice. But now, staring at Captain Briggs, he wasn't so sure. Then Briggs leaned in, his voice lowering just enough to make Greg uneasy. "You have two choices, Officer Lawson. You can let your pride dig you into a deeper hole, or you can admit the truth." Greg swallowed hard. His badge suddenly felt heavier than ever. He had never been questioned like this, never been forced to confront himself in a way that stripped away all his excuses. His pulse pounded in his ears as he weighed his following words. Briggs's eyes stayed locked on his. "I suggest you choose wisely," he said. Greg knew he was at a crossroads. Whatever came next would change everything, and he had no idea what to do for the first time in his life. Greg's mouth felt dry, his palms damp against the cool night air. The silence between him and Captain Briggs was deafening, heavy with the unspoken reality Greg had spent his entire career avoiding. His mind scrambled for a way out, some loophole, some justification. But the truth stood before him, undeniable and unshakable. He had pulled over a black man because it felt normal, because he could. And now, that man wasn't just anyone. He was his superior. Briggs took a step closer, his voice steady but sharp. "Do you even know why you stopped me, Officer Lawson?" Greg stiffened. "Like I said, I don't." Briggs's tone cut through the night like a blade. "We both know there was no real reason. You saw a black man driving a nice car, and that was enough, wasn't it?" Greg's jaw clenched. He had heard these accusations before, on the news, in protest chants, but never directed at him. He had always thought of himself as a good cop. But now, his badge felt like a burden. Briggs exhaled sharply and crossed his arms. "How many times, Lawson?" Greg blinked. "What? How many times have you done this? How many black men have you pulled over tonight? This week? This year?" Greg wanted to deny it. He wanted to defend himself, but a sickening feeling twisted in his gut because the answer wasn't zero. Briggs studied him, waiting. "I read your record," he said finally. "You've made 3 times the number of stops in black neighborhoods than anywhere else. And don't tell me it's because of high crime rates." Greg's face burned. Briggs shook
his head. "You know what the worst part is? You think you're different. You think because you haven't beaten someone senseless or pulled the trigger, you're not part of the problem." He scoffed. "But you are, Lawson. You just hide it better." Greg inhaled sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. For years, he had told himself that the system worked, that he was following protocol. What if someone got pulled over? They must have done something wrong. But now, standing before a black police captain he had wrongfully profiled, the truth hit him like a freight train. It wasn't about the law. It had never been. Briggs let the silence hang before taking a step back. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a long, hard look at yourself. You're going to think about all the times you've done this and ask yourself if you'd do the same to a white driver." Greg swallowed hard. Briggs turned, but he left him with one last sentence before walking away. "And if you can't be honest with yourself, Officer Lawson, then maybe you shouldn't be a cop at all." Greg stood frozen, his pulse hammering, because for the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. Greg stood frozen, watching Captain Briggs walk away, his mind swirling with emotions, anger, shame, confusion. Every instinct in him wanted to deny what had just happened, push back, and justify himself. But he couldn't. His grip tightened around his belt as he forced himself to face the truth. Briggs was right. He hadn't pulled the captain over because of a broken taillight. He hadn't stopped him because of suspicious activity. He had stopped him because, deep down, he had assumed the worst. And it wasn't the first time. Greg returned to his patrol car, staring at his reflection in the side mirror. The red and blue lights flashed, casting an eerie glow over his pale face. His uniform, something he had always worn with pride, felt heavier now, like it carried the weight of something much darker than duty. A soft knock on the window startled him. It was his partner, Officer Reed. "Hey!" Reed said, peering inside. You good, man? What the hell was that about? Greg hesitated. He could still lie. He could say it was a misunderstanding, a mix-up. He could pretend this was just another routine stop gone wrong. But after what just happened, could he keep living in denial? Reed leaned in. Dude, was that really Briggs? His voice held a mix of disbelief and something else. Concern? Amusement? Greg exhaled. Yeah. Reed let out a low whistle. Man, you dodged a bullet. If that was anyone else, you'd probably be all over the news right now. He chuckled. I mean, come on. A black guy in a nice car? You know the drill. Greg's stomach twisted. The words felt like acid in his ears. You know the drill. That was the problem. The drill wasn't about enforcing the law, but about who they enforced it on. Greg stared at his partner, suddenly seeing him in a different light. For years they had joked about things like this. The bad neighborhoods, the suspect descriptions that always seemed to fit a certain kind of person. He had laughed along. He had gone along. But now, standing at this crossroads, the laughter didn't sit right anymore. Reed nudged him. Hey, don't let it get to you. Look, we all do it. Even Briggs probably did it before he got promoted. Greg's jaw tightened. That doesn't make it right. Reed blinked. Whoa, what's with you? Greg opened his mouth, but hesitated. What was with him? Why did it feel like something inside him had shifted? Because it had. He had spent his entire career seeing himself as one of the good guys. But now? Now he wasn't so sure. Look, Reed continued, lowering his voice. Don't overthink this, all right? Just forget it happened. We've got a shift to finish. Forget it? Greg turned, glancing back toward where Briggs had disappeared down the street. He thought about all the black men he had stopped without a second thought. The ones who had been polite, the ones who had been angry, the ones who had been terrified. And then he thought about the ones who never walked away. Something inside him snapped. I don't think I can do this anymore, he muttered. Reed frowned. What do you mean? Greg inhaled sharply. For the first time in his career, he faced a truth he couldn't ignore. I mean, I don't know if I can be a cop if this is what it means. Reed's face darkened. You're not seriously buying into all that systemic racism crap, are you? Greg looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, he realized that Reed wasn't the problem. He was. Without another word, Greg returned to his car, his pulse hammering as he reached for his radio. It may be time to make a choice. It's one he should have made a long time ago. Greg sat in his patrol car, gripping the radio in his hands. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, louder than the distant city noise, more audible than the voice in his head telling him just to let it go. But he couldn't. Not this time. His thumb hovered over the button. What was he even about to say? That he had just racially profiled a black man? That he had been doing it for years without ever questioning it? That something inside him had cracked open, and now he couldn't look at himself the same way? A sharp rap on his window jolted him. Reed. Again. Greg rolled down the window, but Reed's voice came low and firm before he could speak. Don't do this, man. Greg frowned. Do what? Reed's eyes flickered to the radio in Greg's hands. Whatever you're thinking, just don't. Greg stared at him. Why not? Reed let out a bitter laugh. Come on, you really think you're going to change the system by snitching on yourself? You think the department's going to pat you on the back for suddenly waking up? They'll cut you loose in a second, man. Greg's stomach twisted. He knew Reed was probably right. Cops like him, cops who started asking too many questions and didn't just follow the drill, didn't last long. They got pushed out, isolated, worse. And yet, he thought about Captain Briggs. He thought about the look on his face when he had calmly taken off his badge and told Greg precisely what he had done. Not with anger, not with rage, but with truth. And deep down, Greg knew that no matter what happened next, he couldn't return to the man he was before. "I don't care," Greg said finally. Reed's expression hardened. "Then you're a fool." Greg took a shaky breath and pressed the button on the radio. "Dispatch. Officer Greg Mitchell requesting a meeting with Captain Briggs. It's urgent." A moment of silence. Then the reply crackled through. "Copy that, Officer Mitchell." "Captain Briggs is still on duty. He'll meet you at headquarters." Reed cursed under his breath. "You just signed your own death warrant." Greg turned to him, his voice steady. "Number I just took the first step toward being the cop I was supposed to be." Without another word, he put his car in gear and drove toward headquarters, toward a conversation that could cost him everything, but for the first time in his career. He wasn't afraid. Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The road ahead blurred as a storm of thoughts crashed through his mind. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. As he pulled into police headquarters, he spotted Captain Briggs standing by the entrance, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Greg took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and walked toward him. "Officer Mitchell," Briggs said coolly, "let's talk." Greg followed him inside, down the sterile halls lined with framed photos of officers. Many he had once admired. Now they felt like ghosts watching him, reminding him of the rules he was about to break. Inside Briggs' office, the door shut with a soft click. "Sit," Briggs ordered. Greg obeyed. Briggs leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto Greg's. "I read your report. You admitted to racial profiling. You acknowledged misconduct. That's a serious confession, Officer Mitchell." Greg swallowed hard. "I know." Briggs studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't think you do." He stood, pacing the room. "Let me ask you something, Mitchell. Why now? Why, after years of pulling over black men for no reason, do you suddenly care?" Greg hesitated. "Because I finally saw the truth." Briggs scoffed. "The truth? You mean you saw my badge and suddenly realized your mistake?" His voice hardened. "What about the others? What about the men who didn't have a badge to protect them?" Guilt burned in Greg's chest. "I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do next." Briggs took a long breath, staring at Greg like he was trying to decide whether to believe him. "And what exactly do you think happens next?" Greg clenched his fists. "That's up to you, sir." Silence. Then, Briggs walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. "Chief, this is Captain Briggs. We need to talk about Officer Mitchell." Greg's heart pounded. Briggs looked at him, eyes unreadable. Then he spoke. "He's ready to testify." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Greg's confession sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers turned against him. Others secretly admitted they had felt the same, but were too afraid to speak. Briggs helped him file an official complaint, launching an internal investigation. The department tried to bury it, but the media caught wind. Protests erupted. Citizens demanded accountability. And for the first time, Greg truly understood what it meant to fight for justice. Months later, Greg sat in a courtroom, testifying about the culture of racial profiling he had once been part of. Across the room, he spotted Captain Briggs, watching with a nod of quiet approval. Greg had no idea where his career would go from here. Maybe he would lose his badge. Maybe his life would never be the same. But one thing was sure. He had finally done the right thing, and that was worth everything. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, And subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Let's spread the message of hope and unity together. Thanks, and take care.